watching episode 19 of the Modern Girl's Guide to Sewing. You're so close to being done! This is the last video in this series before we get to the shift dress tutorial, which means it's almost time to put all these skills to use. Congratulations on making it this far! In this video, we'll teach you how to make a professional looking neckline, which is a skill you'll definitely need when making handmade clothing.
A floppy, lopsided, or wavy neckline is the biggest giveaway in handmade clothing. So learning how to make a neckline the correct way is one of the most important techniques in apparel sewing.
There are two basic neckline techniques. The first is to create a lining that hides underneath and creates a nice flat neckline like this.
And the second is to add ribbing, which is a super stretchy strip of fabric that runs right along the neckline like this.
We'll show you how both of these techniques work for different neckline shapes and different kinds of fabric.
First, we'll show you how to create a neckline lining. Use your bodice pattern and lay it on the folded edge of your fabric. Pin in place and cut along the same neckline and shoulder edge. Do the same for the back bodice pattern. Now you'll have two neckline lining pieces, one for the front and one for the back. Make sure the stretch of your fabric runs across the lining. If you're working with a stretchy knit fabric, you'll need to stretch the lining as you sew to create a nice flat neckline, so cut 1 inch off of each end on the front and back lining pieces. If you're working with a non-stretchy woven, don't trim the edges. Your lining pieces should match the bodice necklines exactly. For both knits and wovens, serge the bottom edge of your neckline lining pieces before you sew. With right sides together, attach your front and back lining pieces together at the shoulders. If your bodice has a zipper up the back, make sure to cut your back lining piece down the middle to match the bodice. Once your neckline lining is sewn in a loop, let's pin it to the neckline. With right sides together, match up the shoulder seams and then pin around the rest of the neckline. For knit fabric, since the neckline lining will be a few inches smaller, stretch the lining evenly between pins so it fits all the way around the neckline. Now sew around the neckline opening with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, stretching the fabric flat as you sew. Serge your seam allowance, then flip the lining inside the bodice and press flat with your iron. Make sure the lining is slightly lower than the bodice so it doesn't stick up over the neckline and become visible. Now to keep the lining in place so it doesn't flip out and become visible, there are two options. 1. Sew around the entire neckline with a straight, wide stitch like this. You can stitch super close to the neckline edge or up to 1 inch away depending on your preference. Or 2, if you don't want stitching around your neckline, sew right on top of the shoulder seams. This is called stitch in the ditch, when you sew on top of an existing seam, securing your lining in place so it doesn't shift around. Also for this technique, attaching fusible interfacing to the lining will help stabilize it and weigh it down so it doesn't flip out. This works best for thicker knits and wovens so the interfacing doesn't add bulk or show through the top layer of your fabric. You can use this lining technique for any shape of neckline. Just copy the shape of your bodice neckline exactly, and it will work.
The second technique is using ribbing to create a neckline, which you'll only use when creating a neckline with knits. Ribbing is a material you can purchase at any fabric store in the knit fabric section and is a special kind of knit fabric that has raised rows of stitching that make it ultra stretchy. You see this kind of fabric on the neckline of store-bought t-shirts all the time.
However, you can just use regular knit fabric in place of ribbing to create this neckline. This is what we typically do since that's usually what we have on hand. And that's what we'll show you in this tutorial, but you can use either technique. First, determine how wide you want your ribbing to be. We recommend 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 an inch. Decide which one you want, multiply that number by 2, and then add a 1/2 an inch seam allowance. This will be the length of your ribbing. Next, measure the circumference of your bodice neckline and subtract 2 to 3 inches from that measurement. This will be the width of your neckline. Use these two measurements to cut a rectangular piece of fabric for your ribbing. Again, make sure the stretch of your fabric runs across the piece. Fold your ribbing in half with right sides together and sew up the short side. Serge the seam allowance, then fold the ribbing in half with wrong sides together. Now we'll pin it to our neckline. Remember, we cut the ribbing shorter so its circumference will be smaller than the circumference of your neckline. Pin it evenly around the neckline, and then stretch in between pins as you serge so the fabric lays flat together. If your neckline is wide enough that it can fit over your head without it being stretched, you can sew with a straight stitch first and then serge the seam allowance. But if your neckline is small and needs to be stretched to pull over your head, just do a serged seam to allow for stretch. Fold the ribbing up and press flat. If you want to create a V-neck, the method is almost exactly the same. Prep the ribbing, just like you did for a crew neck, and then right before pinning it to the neckline, fold it in half like this and sew a diagonal line across the folded end. Open it up and it's a perfect V. Now pin this to the neckline, matching up the V's on your bodice and ribbing, and sew or serge like before. You can top stitch right below the ribbing to help it lay even flatter, but it's not necessary.
And that's how you create 2 basic necklines.
And guess what? You made it to the end.
We've shared all the sewing skills you need to create almost anything you could ever want to make.
Our very last video will combine all these techniques to create a beautiful shift dress with sleeves, darts, pockets, a zipper, and a professional neckline. We'll see you there.